Now let's read and analyze Archibald MacLeish's Ars Poetica. So we've already read the poem Ars Poetica by Archibald MacLeish. Now let's take a look at it. I think you're going to be pretty amazed with what this poem actually does once you pay attention to the details, once you observe what the poet has done. So it begins with, a poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit. So I see here first some words. Do we know what they mean? Palpable. Palpable is something that you can touch. What does mute mean? You guys know this. It's on your remote control. Mute. It means to silence. So they're saying a poem should be something you can touch that is silent. And then it makes the simile comparison as a globed fruit. So what's a globed fruit? That's obviously a round fruit, an orange, an apple, a peach. A poem should be palpable and mute like a round fruit. It should be touchable and silent. And then the next stanza begins with one word, dumb. Obviously, you might think that means not smart, but dumb also means unable to speak. So if somebody was mute, they would say that person was dumb. It's literally meaning someone who can't speak. So they say a poem should be dumb, like no words, not able to speak, as old medallions to the thumb. What are medallions? Medallions are medals or coins, round objects, and to the thumb, you might keep them in your pocket. And if you have your hand in your pocket, you can imagine yourself just sort of rubbing that medallion with your thumb. It's that kind of no words, that experience, right? So you can see how the globed fruit is palpable, touchable, and silent. You can see how the medallion to the thumb is also no words, but has meaning. And remember, we're making a comparison. This is a metaphor. The poem should be like these things. In the third stanza, the poem should be silent. So now we're starting to see a pattern, and I'm going to notice this over here in diction. Our poem needs to be mute, our poem needs to be dumb, and our poem needs to be silent. These three words all mean the same thing, but poems are full of words. So that's an interesting juxtaposition. Putting two things next to each other, you think, how can that be? Let's follow Archibald MacLeish and see where he goes with this. So far we have a poem should be palpable and mute like a globed fruit. It should be dumb like a medallion to your thumb. It should be silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. Well, I'm going to put that over here with images. A sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges. These are like window ledges, like window sills. And he also says moss has grown. So this idea that moss is growing on the ledges of stone. In the next, which again, they're silent, this is something that makes no sound, but there's something interesting, something attractive about it. And we know that because people take photographs of things like this in downtown Charleston. The next lines suggest a poem should be, here we have it again, wordless. As the flight of birds is an image. I don't know if you guys know about the flight of birds, but birds fly in a V. And there's one bird at the front of the V, and then the two lines of the V are birds falling out in succession. So their pattern is a V. And the reason they do that is because the bird at the front of the V is doing most of the work. And everyone else behind that V, and if you ever ride bikes or race car drivers even, they do this thing called drafting. And that's where if you're behind a force that's moving really fast and it's doing all the work, just by getting behind it, you can get pulled into their draft and move. Well, that's how birds fly. So what's really neat about it, and this might be where it's wordless or without sound, is that the lead bird, when it gets tired, it drops back and goes to the end of one of the points of the V. And when it does that, the next bird in line moves to the front and keeps powering the flight of birds. And that is a thing of beauty. So if you ever see a group of birds on the seashore in the sky flying in a V, pay attention for a few minutes, observe, and you might notice the lead bird drop out and another bird move up and take over. And that is poetry. It's just something beautiful to behold. The next line says a poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. So motionless in time is different than silent, but it's still that kind of idea of without. Like instead of moving and making noise, we're silent and still. So I'm going to put motionless over here in my diction to help us kind of focus on how these words make meaning. And the example for motionless in time is as the moon climbs. Well, that is a very interesting image. And I'm going to also put that down here as detail. Because when you're talking about the moon climbing, you can't really see the movement, yet you know that it starts on the horizon and ends up in the upper sky. So this movement that is motionless, I guess maybe what MacLeish is saying is when you're in a poem, time should stop, even while you're moving. Interesting thought there. The next one is a poem should be equal to, not true. So this is a comparison. So I'm going to put it over here with language, this idea of a poem should be equal to, not true. Because this is really saying that it's exactly what we're trying to do with language. We're trying to use language to make meaning, but we can only say what a thing seems like. We can't really say what a thing is. And this, goes back to the earliest educators. They would say, like, how do we know to call grass, grass, or rocks, rocks? Like, where did these words come from? And they're just like sounds that are representations for the thing. And it isn't the thing itself, it's just a word for the thing, and that's getting all very deep, but I think that's kind of what Archibald MacLeish is just trying to say here. A poem should be equal to an idea. It won't necessarily be true, but it will represent, and we've talked about this already, that idea of a universal truth. The poem takes a shift here. So from the top to this point, we're hearing a poem should be this, a poem should be this, a poem should be this. The common thread is it should be mute, it should be dumb, it should be silent, it should be wordless, it should be motionless, it shouldn't move. Then we get those concrete examples, the ledges where the moss has grown, the flight of birds, the moon climbing, the sleeve-worn stone, the medallions to the thumb, right? So those are all details. I'm going to put medallions to the thumb here because I forgot that one. So those are the details that we're noticing. And then the poem shifts, and it shifts right here. And it goes, leaving, as the moon releases twig by twig the night entangled trees. So it sounds like we're still talking about this moon that's kind of climbing up over the horizon. And this leaving as the moon releases twig by twig is sort of, when you're looking out at the night sky, if there's a tree between you and the sky, you can sort of see the moon moving between the branches, right? So now it's talking about movement. I'm going to put this up here with diction. But this movement is a new tonal word, the word leaving. Leaving is like goodbye. It's like closing a door on something. And so the poem has shifted here. Let's see where it goes. The next stanza repeats it. Leaving, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind. Well, one detail that I want to notice right away here is winter. And it's actually winter leaves. But what we know about winter is winter always represents what? Always represents what? Yeah, winter represents death, right? In the wintertime, everything gets cold, frozen over, dies. So that's kind of our first clue. Well, it's not really the first one. It's the first one we're noticing right now. The first clue that there's something going on in this poem. We've got leaving like the winter, leaving like death, memory by memory, the mind. So what's actually leaving are the memories. That is a really important detail. Memory by memory, the mind. What are we afraid of? We're afraid of forgetting. We're afraid of being forgotten. We're afraid that people won't remember us. So I'm seeing something emerge here. The moon, now that I think about it, moons are also related to nighttime, right? So I'm going to just make a note here. Moon, nighttime. Nighttime is related to the symbol for death as well. You remember in class we've talked about the morning of our life is when we're born, our summer of life or the afternoon of our life is sort of that peak, and then the fall, and then the winter of our life. Winter is when we're near death or dying. So there's the season representing it, and we're losing our memories. The next stanza says, a poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. So now what happened? This is huge, and you wouldn't know this, but I'm going to tell you. This stanza is repeated. We have it here, and then we see it again down here, right? And what happens when this stanza is repeated is in between, something really different happened. So look up. We've got a poem should be, all these things that a poem should be, right? Then the moon climbs, and all of a sudden we get these two leaving stanzas. But as soon as we get the idea of death, and we're starting to lose our memory, and that makes us sad, the speaker in the poem escapes. He comes right back out of that meaning and goes back to the comparison. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. Now we know, and we've already talked about this, that the moon's not actually motionless. It just appears to be. Then the last four stanzas. A poem should be equal to, not true. We talked about that, right? For all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. So this is our next idea, that we're talking about death. This is the history of grief, right? And then this is an image. This is a really, really concrete image. And I think that this image is showing us maybe inside the speaker's actual memory, the idea of an empty doorway where nobody comes through. And the maple leaf, we've already talked about the seasons and how winter is death, but fall, of course, is what leads up to it. And here we have our maple leaf in the empty doorway. And then the last two stanzas. We're going to shift again. So if we were looking at the connotation of our words, we saw a lot of negatively connotated words here in the middle of this. But now we're coming out, again, we're coming out of that feeling we had. And for love, the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. So now the tone has shifted. It's a more positive experience. And that experience is leaning grasses. I'm going to imagine this as like the dunes grasses out at the beach, and two lights above the sea. Maybe a lighthouse and a boat coming home to that lighthouse. Those are the two lights I'm going to imagine there. A poem should not mean, but be. At the end here, Archibald MacLeish is telling us, this doesn't mean, it just is. This was the speaker's experience written in words. But I think you can see it now that we walked through it together. We've got tangible comparisons of poetry, but we've also got this memory, or this loss of memory, this idea of dying that emerges in the middle. Use these analysis as you fill out your acronym for analyzing literature, DIDLS.